Welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast. Sit back and listen to interviews, discussion about books, and anything else literary. There's always something or someone new on the show. Good evening, listeners. Welcome to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast, Behind the Books, Honest Voices, Real Stories. I'm Amy Shannon, and tonight we step into the living past, resonant histories, because every life deserves to be heard. Together we'll uncover stories that breathe beyond the page, weaving memory and history into conversation. You never know what echoes we'll find, so let's begin. So, I was just interviewing an author who had some infamy based off of some acts that he did, but he was suffering from a form of mental illness. And there was something that just kind of caught, both of us, was that, where I was a teenager, a young girl, but I remember, what he had done, and his name kind of, if you were born then, or, old enough to remember what had happened. But now, there are things in our past, not even that long ago, 20, 30, 40 years. I wish to think of that not being long ago because I was over 50. But I realized that when I told my kids, I'm like, yeah, I'm interviewing so-and-so, and they're like, who's that? And I was like, really? And then I explained, and then it was like, when I was talking to him on the podcast, and if you follow this regularly, you'll know who I'm talking about when that airs, that the new generation, they don't know his name, but he is doing music, so he should be known for that, not for terrible acts. So, and it was, his actions were because of mental health issues, and the fact that he was actually very good at hiding them to the rest of the people who cared about him, or just people around him in general. So I was thinking about that, and then the other day I was going through a pile of books that I kind of inherited from my dad. He still, as the time of this recording, he still has end-stage dementia. And I have some of his books, and one of them is a Time magazine book called The Greatest Events of the 20th Century. So I thought that I would kind of go through a little bit about what happened before many of you were born. Actually, some of these happened before I was born. So, okay, I was born in 1972. There, now you have my age. So, I'm just going to go through slightly. So, in 1914, World War I began. And it began because somebody decided to shoot or kill, assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. That made people mad, and they decided to go to war because of one assassination. The war ended in 1918. In 1917, Russian and the Germans entered. And so when it ended in 1918, November 11th, 1918, it was known as Armistice Day, and today it is known as Veterans Day. It's always on November 11th, and that is why it's Veterans Day. Armistice meant the ending of the war. Then more interesting things happened. And President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in 1932, and this was after the start of the Great Depression. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Many people leaped from buildings because they lost their money. I remember asking my grandmother, she was born in 1921. She had passed a couple years ago, at 101, and asked her what it was like growing up in the Depression, because she would have been, just entering her teenage years. And her father was a gentleman farmer, and he also worked at General Electric. Her mother worked very hard on the farm, and as the children got older, they all had chores they had to do. But she said that they didn't really see the effects directly of the Great Depression because they had food from their crops. They had two types of crops, she said. Crops that they ate or stored, for winter or future use, canning, things like that. And also, they had crops for selling. They would bring them to, they had farmers markets back then. They would take them and sell them. Also, during the Great Depression, if their neighbors were suffering, they had low food, low fuel, like coal. That was a big, a lot of heating devices ran on coal or wood. So she said that her family, her father mainly, would provide, would give their neighbors food and coal, whatever they needed. And that's just the kind of person my great grandfather was. And with that, that's what kind of people his children were. And they passed it on. So, it was a very hard time in history. If you watch the old show, The Walton, it kind of depict what some life was like. And so it was just a rough time. And unfortunately, what got them out of it was when World War II started. And it started when Germany's dictator had his army invade Poland in 1939. What happened was several officers were prisoners in a concentration camp. Germans were dressed as like the Polish army, so they could kill and infiltrate their army. it wasn't until in 1940 the British Army escapes when the German Army attacked. And then December 7th, 1941, the Japanese, wanting the United States to be part of the war, they attacked Pearl Harbor. And that was basically, they shot her around the world, and many people died, military and civilians. And President Roosevelt continued being president. He continued on until he served almost 4 terms. Well, he served 4 terms, but he died during the 4th term. And then in August of 1945, the U.S. atom bombs 2 Japanese cities. And it was basically who had the bigger bombs. People were coming off of the knowledge of the German Holocaust and what he did to anyone who was not German. And Germans, just so people know, that you are only a German citizen or considered German if it is a bloodline. You could live there and not be a German, but if you're not part of the bloodline, you're not German. And many people spread to different areas, the ones that survived. And a lot happens. A lot of wars. The Korean War. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961, separating East and West Germany. Then there's the assassination of John F. Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963. A lot of times you hear people saying, oh, where were you then? Do you remember that? I wasn't born yet. My father, it was the same time he had his accident when he was literally run over by a car 3 times. And the day he woke up, it wasn't being announced on the radio that John F. Kennedy had been shot, and he was telling his aunt and uncle who had come to visit him, because they hadn't heard the news yet. Then the offensive of Vietnam. The difference between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And what they called something that wasn't a war. They called it a police action. And then in 1975, South Vietnam falls. So basically, the war is over. And this is kind of like, so this has happened before I was born. Then, and this is only 2 years after I was born, Richard Nixon resigned. If you aren't familiar with Richard Nixon, he was the United States president. He was also impeached. And Gerald Ford, the only president to never have been elected to office, was a vice president and then became president. When Nixon's vice president resigned, he appointed Gerald Ford as his vice president. So no one ever voted for Gerald Ford. And then when his term was over, after serving the rest of Nixon's term, that was it. He was never again. And there are times now in life, things happen. Those who were there remember them as history, good or bad. Some don't remember them at all because they may have been not born or very, very young. Some of us, even as kids, might have heard stuff that our parents were talking about, but we weren't allowed to hear it because we were too young to understand. And then we talked about how the Berlin Wall went up, and in 1989, Ronald Reagan was president, and the wall came crashing down. And of course, Desert Storm, another war, another dictator, Saddam Hussein, who eventually got his own thing. You know, we had more presidents, Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and on and on and on. Some had some rocky presidencies, and others did not. People used to mock Ronald Reagan because he would, one of the things he would repeatedly say was, "I don't remember that." And people thought it was mockery. You know, they would mock him because, oh, you don't remember, something like that. And it wasn't until way after his presidency that it had been revealed that he had Alzheimer's and probably had the early onset during that time. I think now that makes it so that, you know, with the older presidents and their abilities, you know, their capacity for performing and being, you know, sound mind, have come to conclusions where maybe that they don't want to admit it or whatever, but it comes out. I'm not here to discuss politics. I keep my opinions to myself. I never discuss politics or religion. Those two things start wars or revolution or insurrection. So, and divide family and friends literally to the point of where they are estranged forever just because they don't agree. I don't know what happened to the regular debating of what's going on. I think now the only debates are when they talk about sports. In April 19th, 1995, the Oklahoma City Federal Building was bombed. And within that was a child care center. And many people, including several children, died then. But also, the 20th century was not all bad. Those were just like, disasters. We got Henry Ford's Model T. We got, um, regulations for food and drug. The Food and Drug, uh, Act, um, because of not just unsanitary food, um, but, a lot of things were just something. Um, it, we, it wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s that there was a Child Protective Service actual department. Prior to that, if children were abused, they were, um, taken from their families, either from the police officers or doctors, and they were put in orphanages. Um, and, um, but there wasn't much. Sometimes you could come back and sometimes you could not come back from that. Um, and there was, the growth of technology, fast food. I mean, McDonald's, started with their 15-cent hamburger. Um, then you had natural disasters, so the San Francisco earthquake, the Titanic, 1912. And when we were going through COVID, and a lot of people were comparing it to the influenza epidemic in 1918. It lasted for about a year, and it was, at the time, the most widespread disaster of the century. Then, COVID hit, and we're in this new century, but it was, a lot of people had compared it to that, that pandemic. Um, we have the Hindenburg, and if I am telling you things that you don't know, Google it. I mean, this is history. History. I love history. Family history, local history, world history, history of how we are, how we overcame, how sometimes it takes something bad to happen to make something good happen from it. And that is something that, um, it continues to go on. Something bad happens, we look at security. Uh, we examine, I'm not saying me, when I say but as people, we examine what happened, what went wrong, um, you know, um, and I remember January 28th, 1986. I was in 8th grade, and they brought a TV into the auditorium so we could watch the Challenger launch with the first teacher in space. Within a few seconds, it exploded. School children from around the world were watching as it exploded on national TV. There were so many, they had, and I know this from my principal, that a lot of teachers had applied to be part of it. My principal was actually one of them, but they narrowed it down. I don't know how they, whatever they did, but, um, every life on that, space shuttle, was gone. But it made them revamp and look at other, how to help future space issues. And there have been more since then. And then, we take another step back. In the 1920s, women finally get the right to vote. It took years and centuries of women wanting to be able to speak their mind, be able to vote how they wanted to vote. And unfortunately, that took a long time. And some of the people that had fought for it didn't live to see the day that women had the right to vote. Also in 1920, prohibition, that didn't last very long. People were having underground speakeasies and hiding the alcohol, creating their own, and sometimes it was dangerous and sometimes it wasn't. And we have, in 1968, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. In 1995, the late O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of murder in a criminal trial. But the civil trial was something totally different. And after that, no one believed it. He didn't do it. So there are plenty of disasters. There's a lot of discoveries and just amazing technology, airplanes and cars and Amelia Earhart and her disappearance, space shuttles, men just orbiting the Earth, John Glenn, man landing on the moon. But it was history, and we should learn from history. And then even in the new century, we're very short in it. Right now, think about a lot of the 20-somethings now, they were little kids. I know that because my children were small, 9/11. And I remember exactly what happened, where I was, what I was doing, and it's just one of those things. So, this is just a brief history of the 20th century. If you are interested in history, not just what's happened in the past 25 years, because a lot has happened, even to me personally, but also happened, and where sometimes we've taken huge leaps, other times we've only taken a few steps, and still there is hatred and bigotry and slavery and human trafficking, and that's just a word that describes what has been going on for probably centuries that no one just knew about, the selling of human beings. or trading of human beings against their will. So, thank you. It's the end of another great conversation. Audience, I just want to thank you for listening. Please follow this podcast on Spotify. If you wish to be on the show, just go to amysbookshelfreviews.com/podcast and schedule your pre-recording. If you are a historian, if you've written nonfiction or fiction books, I would love to hear from you and have you on this segment, The Living Past. I'm Amy Shannon. Be safe, be well, and always be kind. Thank you. Tune in here again next week for another tantalizing discussion. Thank you for listening to Amy's Bookshelf Reviews podcast.